Keep one eye on the road, the other one fixed on a one you hold.
Welcome to Soccer Morning on NASN. Here's your host, Jason Davis.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome into Soccer Morning on a Wednesday. Jason Davis here with you, as always. Music today, courtesy of our Finnish friend, Antti. Thank you very much for your support, Antti, and the music. And if you want to be a person who makes the music for Soccer Morning, because you got to get your music out there. Sharing music, that's what Spotify is built on. Everybody share their music. There's some of those things that you're embarrassed about. Those are your guilty pleasure songs. You really don't want anybody to see that you listen to them, but then you want to share your other stuff. Thank you to Auntie for that. Go to soccermorning.com and help support the show. If you want to pick some music, you can do that. Contribute to the program as we move forward towards the World Cup, steaming very, very quickly towards the World Cup. Everybody's roster starting to trickle out now. Yeah, you can also guest co-host on this show. If you support Soccer Morning, soccermorning.com. Sit in, be the guy, be the witty person on the show. I'm not that witty. I lead I'm the cruise director, move things along. Got a big show today that I'm going to be directing. But if you want to sit in and be the guy who chimes in with the funny thing, you be that guy. Soccermorning.com. World Cup roster is coming out very, very shortly. Lots of things happening there. In fact, if you're interested in what I think Jurgen Klinsmann will do, not my selections, but what I think Jurgen Klinsmann will do, go do ESPN FC. Look for the World Cup 23 as selected by the editors and writers at ESPNFC.com. I'm included in there. We can review those things if you want. We'll certainly take phone calls as we get moving towards the World Cup on all of your questions, concerns, guesses, hopes, dreams for the U.S. national team. We're also going to be looking at the World Cup in a much bigger picture. And to that point, we have Alex Bellos, the author of Football, The Brazilian Way of Life, which is available on Amazon.com. It's an update to a 2002 book that Alex wrote. We'll talk to him in a couple of minutes about his book and about how integrated football truly is into the culture of Brazil, which is the focus of his book. We're also going to have John Arnold, CONCACAF John, from Goal. You've heard him on World Football Phone-In. If you're a listener of that program, he is a new CONCACAF expert there, and he's a perfect choice. Knows a lot about not just the United States and Mexico and Canada, but Central America, the Caribbean as well. So we'll talk to John. As Honduras releases their roster, gets their names out there, we'll talk about Costa Rica, Mexico, maybe even focus a little bit on news out of Mexico that Querétaro, because of their ownership problems and the former owner of Querétaro, because the government is in control of that club now, the former owner of Querétaro being brought up on corruption charges, it may keep Atlante in the top division in Mexico. This is just what they do down there. The football is great. They have fantastic players. They obviously win everything in the region, but there's shenanigans happening in Mexico way too often. Also on this program at 11 o'clock, Pete Shad, the voice of the Vancouver Whitecaps up in Vancouver, will talk to us about the Canadian Championship game tonight. Vancouver in Toronto to take on TFC. I'm always, it's one of those situations. We have the U.S. Open Cup down here, and we always debate how important that truly is to the teams. We obviously have visual evidence of how important it is when these clubs put out weaker lineups than they could. They don't put out their best 11. They put out kids. They put out reservists. Looks like Vancouver is going to be doing that tonight. What does that say? This is a competition Vancouver has never won. It's been going on since 2008, the Canadian Championship. I think it's sponsored by Amway now. Used to be Nutrilite. So all about that. All about that. What is that stuff called? The marketing, the companies that do the pyramid schemes, essentially. Multi-level marketing. That's right. Thank you very much. Yeah. All about the multi-level marketing up there for the sponsorship of that tournament. It's the Voyagers Cup. I mean, let's call it what the fans call it, because the trophy is the Voyagers Cup as given to the competition by the fans up in Canada. So we'll talk to Pete Shad about what Vancouver will be doing tonight in that game, perhaps what they expect out of TFC, because TFC had the weekend off. They've got Michael Bradley headed to the World Cup. I've read reports that he might not play again for TFC before he leaves for U.S. national team camp. And you have Jermaine Defoe coming back from injury, and there's a chance that Toronto will field a very close to full strength lineup minus Michael Bradley. So we'll talk to Pete about that. Yesterday's events, of course, we have to cover yesterday. Yesterday in England, Manchester United finishes out their home campaign with a 3-1 win over Hull. Story of the day, couple of stories. Number one, James Wilson scoring 2 goals on his senior debut for Manchester United. That kid's also scored for the U18s and the U21s this year at Manchester United. Now, of course, we get and I know that, look, the fans chanting James Wilson for England is a little tongue-in-cheek. I'm sure it's a lot tongue-in-cheek. And I'm not saying that anybody's actually suggesting it, but it does kind of bring up the issue of hype when it comes to kids like this who make a big splash on their debut. And I'm not saying James Wilson won't be a star at some point or won't be very good at some point for Manchester United or somebody else for that matter. But if you remember, Federico Macheda scored on his debut and was supposed to be the next thing. Where's Macheda right now? Anybody know? Somebody look up where Macheda is right now, because pretty sure he's in the lower division somewhere. He's on loan at Birmingham City. Okay, that's not terrible. It's down in the championship, right? Birmingham City. So, but he did not, obviously. He's 22 now. He obviously did not become as quickly what everybody thought he might based on his big splash. I apologize. Martin says that New England, the TFC lost to New England on the weekend. Did I blank on that game? You're right, I did. I meant maybe it's this weekend they have off. That's what I meant. Apologies. Not last week and this week. So they have a chance to rest guys between now and their next MLS game. All right. There's also MLS on the docket today. Well, maybe we'll address that stuff a little bit later. But Manchester United finishing out their campaign. Of course, Ryan Giggs, the interim manager, the caretaker for the time being. Everybody believes that Louis Van Gaal will come in, will take over, will bring that club some respect at the top of the organization again, try to clean up the mess that David Moyes made. We'll see if they make any major moves in the summer transfer window. I saw quotes from Giggs, who played, by the way. That was the thing that was really interesting, is Ryan Giggs, who came out for his first game in charge in a suit looking like a manager. Second game in charge, puts himself on the subs bench, obviously wearing a warm-up suit, a track suit, on the bench because he might put himself in. And he ended up putting himself in, nearly scored, or nearly had a chance to score. Probably should have won a handball penalty on that, maybe. A little dicey. But he certainly looked spry in the couple of minutes he was on the field. And I think the factoids, which obviously come out when those things happen, when these unique situations happen. So that Ryan Giggs is the first Manchester United manager to play since 1921 and the first manager in the Premier League to play since 2000. That doesn't seem that long ago, 14 years, but something about Brentford City. Was Brentford City in the Premier League in 2000? Oh, I have to go back and look. My historical knowledge of the Premier League doesn't go back to 2000 in Brentford City. I mean, it might go back to 2000, just not Brentford City. All right, it's a good way to start the show. Plenty to cover today. When we come back, Alex Bellos will join us. We'll talk about his book on football in Brazil, the culture, the way of life that it is down there. Soccer Morning, North American Soccer Network, NASN.TV, soccermorning.com. Be right back.
Welcome back to Soccer Morning on NASN with Jason Davis.
Back on Soccer Morning. It's loud, it's heavy. I don't know if that's actually Finnish, but it is Auntie's selection, so it seems to fit the stereotype. Auntie. Joining me now via Skype, Alex Bellos, author of Football, The Brazilian Way of Life, which you can find at Amazon.com. Alex, how are you, sir?
I'm good. I'm here in London. I'm talking about Brazil, but I'm in London today.
It's a world game. It's a small world now. We can connect with you instantaneously via technology. It makes for very interesting conversations, no matter what the topic is. And I'm sort of looking at the synopsis of the book, and I realize that this is an updated version of the book you wrote in 2002. Alex, the first thing that strikes me, and I'll admit that we've covered the happenings in Brazil, the recent happenings in Brazil, a lot on this program. And I wonder how that fits into it. I know you've updated the book with some of those things. How does that all fit into your picture of football as part of Brazilian culture?
Right. I don't really think it changes anything. So I wrote my book originally for the 2002 World Cup. And what I did, I was living in Brazil at the time as the Guardian correspondent. And I spent a couple of years going around. I visited almost every state in Brazil just to try and sort of tell the story of Brazil through football, because football really influences absolutely everything in Brazil. And, with the protests that were happening last year, there's this thing that, is Brazil falling out of love with football? Mm-hmm. Is it less important than it was? And I don't really think it's true. If anything, you could say that it confirms how passionately people think about football, because they're deciding to protest against the government. How do they do it? They're using football. Mm-hmm. And whereas lots of people say, oh, this was a kind of statement against the government, that people were protesting. Actually, I think what is really going to stick with people is, you probably were talking about it, is the way that during the Confederations Cup, when the national anthems were being played, the way that the crowd responded to the Brazilian anthem and carried on playing beyond the however 10 seconds that you're allowed to do by FIFA. And that actually there is probably more of people are kind of more behind the national team because of that and now really than they were, especially during the 2010 World Cup, where people really were not that bothered by it. Now you see what you have. You have a team that is playing football the way they like it to be played. You have a star in Neymar, who is the kind of in the pantheon of great Brazilian kind of attacking midfielders, sort of forward players. He's someone who can change a game, who's made kind of Brazilians fall back in love with football.
I'm certainly tracking exactly with what you're saying based on all the conversations I've had about what's happening now. It's almost like football is this sacrosanct element of Brazilian life that is sort of so separate from everything that happens in government and the way that the country is administered, that the people sort of, as you said, they sort of hold these two things separately. And in a lot of ways, football is the real Brazil, and all of the government inaction and mismanagement is the secondary element.
I think what you have is that you have football, and then you have the organization of football. Mm-hmm. And the organization of football is the worst of Brazil. It's corrupt, it's badly managed, it's sort of incompetent, it's a complete disaster. And we could go into the reasons for why it is, but it's kind of not so interesting. But what you have is football itself. And the reason why football is so important is football is the greatest symbol of Brazilian identity. Mm-hmm. It's what brings people together. But more than that, it's what makes Brazilians feel Brazilian. And in my book, I kind of wanted to kind of tell this story. And people, when we think about the great Brazil sides, people remember kind of like 1970, maybe 1982. That's kind of from when there was television. Mm-hmm. But really the side that was probably like the most important was the 1938 side, which was the World Cup was in France. Brazil went there. No one really knew who they were. No one really knew anything about them. They were the team that amazed. And in Leonidas da Silva, their striker, called the Black Diamond, He was the highest scorer. He was the best player. He even scored. His boot came off, got stuck in the mud, and he scored barefoot.
Yeah.
So when he came back to Brazil, it was this idea that football was the one thing that Brazil were good at. It was the one thing that showed this kind of creativity, all the things that was supposed to represent Brazilianness. So it was right back from the 1930s when Brazilians began to think, do you know what? That's what defines us. That's what reflects us. And what was interesting is that Brazil, there's the history of slavery comes into all of this. Brazil imported more slaves in the Americas than anywhere else and abolished it later than anywhere else. So at the beginning of the 20th century, it was seen to be this mess that they had this big kind of black underclass that was seen to be in the kind of slightly racist political opinions of the time as kind of dragging the country down. And all of a sudden football came along. I thought, no, our racial mixture is what makes us brilliant. It's what defines us as different, as exciting. And we've kind of invented this new game, it's an English game, football, but we've made it something different. And I think it's this feeling of pride that basically it was through football, it sort of brought all the different sides of Brazil together. It gave them a meaning, and that meaning is still there. So, what is it that makes me feel English? It's the fact that I'm punctual. It's the fact that, we have a functioning democracy, et cetera, et cetera. It's the fact that I have tea at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. What makes Brazilians feel Brazilian? It's the fact that they love football, that they're good at football, they're the best in the world, and the fact that football is everywhere. So when a Brazilian is playing football, he's playing it. He realizes that he's an ambassador for his country, but for everything about his country. And that's slightly different to how any other country plays football, because it's not so tied to this whole idea of national identity.
It seems to be a love of the game for the game itself, rather than through the lens of big time professional football or what's on television or how many fans you have in the stand. It's just about the actual love of either playing or being involved or whatever. And I also find it fascinating, the history of Brazil and sort of the people and the game sort of resisting any effort on authority's part, be it the government or someone else, to appropriate football. And we've certainly seen efforts, and I know during the junta years there was an attempt to sort of take the national identity of the national football team and use that to the military junta's advantage.
Yeah, what I in fact write about so I read the book 2002, and there's a new chapter, and the new chapter takes us on from 2002 to the present day. And essentially what I write about, because I'm trying to always write about kind of the culture surrounding the game and how it's represented in Brazilian culture. And the big change there's been since 2002 was the election of Lula, to be Brazilian president, who was the first working class kind of man of the people to become president. And the way I see it is that he was essentially the first football fan to become Brazilian president, because all the Brazilian presidents before, of course, they liked football, especially the dictatorship ones, but very much from the position of, I'm a friend of the directors, I'm using football to serve my purposes. So what happened with Lula is that all of a sudden he was this crazy football fan. And actually Lula said in 2002, during the elections, the first thing I do when I get into power, if I get into power, I'm going to put up a football pitch at the presidential palace, because that's what it lacks. And it's very true. The first thing that he did when he got into power is that he put a football pitch right in the presidential palace and would play every Sunday with his cabinet ministers and his friends. The first legislation that he put in, the first two laws that he passed, were all to do with football. And actually, he had this really strange, he was such a football fan that when in 2006, he had a special video conference with the Brazilian team in Germany just to wish them luck. Rather than a very formal event, he actually said, "So, Coach Barreira, who was the coach at the time, can you just tell the nation, is Ronaldo fat?" And this was a question that everyone was interested in. You can't say that if you're a president. And it was almost kind of football kind of coming full circle, rather than having football ran by the dictatorship, the junta type people at the top. Now the government had a football fan at the top who was turning, these official moments actually into something that was like a kind of a bar chat with a bunch of footballers.
No, there are certainly examples in warnings of fans and country, just society taking these things too seriously. And I don't know that the inquiry into Ronaldo's experience in '98 is part of that. I don't know if that's something you address in the book, but there's a line maybe. And I guess my question would be do you address sort of where that line might be in Brazil, and is there any danger of football becoming too important?
I'm not sure how you would ever draw that line, and who am I to judge?
Right.
But definitely, I was living in Brazil for the 1998 World Cup, and 2 years later, in 2000, when there was this parliamentary inquiry, there are actually two inquiries into the state of football, and essentially it was an inquiry as to why Brazil lost the final. So whereas most countries would be overjoyed to be second in a World Cup, the fact that Brazil was second was a cause for this sort of soul-searching and this really quite far-reaching investigation into which Ronaldo was actually called up to the Senate, or no, it was the Senate, is the House of Representatives in Brazil, and had to basically give evidence like a witness in a trial. And I was there for that. I saw that. I've got a whole chapter giving all the details about what went on, what they found out. And I think that what was really going on there, it was not so much why have we lost football, why did we lose the World Cup? It was Nike. Have Nike kind of sold us down the river? Yeah. Because that was one of the first World Cups where Nike, it was so prominent. There was the amazing ad of the Brazilian team in the airport, kind of dribbling the ball. Ronaldo, who I think was only 21 at the time, had such a lot of pressure, and he had this weird sort of kind of convulsions just before the final and didn't play very well. And there was this idea that actually it was sort of Nike's fault for putting so much commercial pressure on him to play, and that he kind of collapsed. Whether or not that is true, who knows? It's still a bit of a mystery what went on. Mm-hmm. But I think the feeling from that was that, no, we as Brazilians need to retain what football is for us, and we can't sell it to Nike. And actually what happened is that the people who run Brazilian football are just as corrupt, just as self-serving, just as incompetent as they always have been, and have kept on trying to make as much money for themselves as possible. But the big sports manufacturers, people like Nike, have become a lot more sensitive to how countries feel about national identity. Because, Brazil, it was a colonized nation. So it has this sort of mindset that people just come to Brazil, take the good stuff and take it away. So that's what they did with the gold. That's what they did with, now sort of the coffee, the iron, all the products that Brazil makes a living. People come along and kind of plunder it. And I think they were feeling that it was a kind of modern day plundering was going on. And obviously it's a lot more complicated than that, but this is the narrative that exists. And I think that it has changed because the big companies like Nike have got a bit sensitive to that. And also the other thing which has changed in the last few years is that from always being, the country of the future, the country with such potential, Brazil has become, thanks to Lula, the president, of course, a big player internationally. Its economy was growing for about 4% on average a year for the 8 years he was in parliament. He was president. Brazil has become this big global player as one of the BRIC nations with Russia, India, China. So there is a bit more of a self-confidence. And I think that whereas Brazil, in the 1950 World Cup, they lost the final, and it was the greatest tragedy imaginable. They still call it their Hiroshima. If Brazil were to get to the final and lose this time, they would be upset, but it wouldn't have such far-reaching consequences because Brazil realized, we got a lot going for us. We don't just have football.
Well, you talk about the things that people come and take away. One of the things that Brazil is famous for exporting, of course, is footballers. And you can look in any league in the world, and there are bound to be Brazilians, and probably more than a handful of them.
Yeah.
And I wonder how, and obviously the big names like Neymar draw the headlines, and there's always this question of stay or go, and and whether or not the money coming back to his club is the a true benefit for Brazilian football. And I wonder where they feel they are in terms of keeping players at home. Is it just there's so many players and we're Brazil and we're about football, it doesn't matter if our Neymars leave?
Right. Well, there's so much to talk about there. The first thing I'll say is that, yes, Brazil is the world's biggest exporter of footballers. In 2012, about 1,500 Brazilians were transferred into the abroad outside of Brazil, the world's football leagues. And actually, the very first chapter of my book, I follow one of those footballers who is following his dream to play in Europe. He plays in the Faroe Islands. So the Faroe Islands is basically, it's quite near Iceland. It belongs to Denmark. Most people in Europe haven't even heard of the Faroe Islands. They have a tiny league. The team that the Brazilian who I was following went to play with, it's not even the main team in the Faroe Islands. It's this tiny hamlet. It's only a few houses and a fish factory. And everyone loves the Brazilians. The Brazilians aren't really even any good. It's just that they look Brazilians. They convey happiness. They shave their heads. They speak Portuguese. They do the kind of the dazzling skills, even though maybe it's not very effective in the freezing cold Faroe Islands. But so you have this. And what I wanted to say was that it's kind of wonderful and tragic at the same time, because he is following his dream. He is playing in Europe. He is the star of where he is. But he's isolated in the middle of nowhere. He can't speak the language. It's freezing cold. He misses his family. He misses Brazil. But then he knows that he's the ambassador of his country playing football. It's like, he is Brazil. He kind of fascinated. If you're a half good Brazilian, you could probably get sold somewhere in the world. They will want you just because you're Brazilian. What's happened with the other players, and we're talking about the big stars, this is much more relevant to say, for example, what is the Brazilian style anymore? Because most of the Brazilians leave Brazil when they're kind of teenagers. They leave really young. They start playing in, say, the good or some of the major leagues in Europe. They're learning to play in a completely different style. And that's one of the reasons why the great, or the most successful, the best paid Brazilian footballers of the moment are really essentially defenders rather than attacking players. And that's kind of because they're going young. The players that are seen to be good, that are young, are the kind of rather tougher players. They're needing to make it in these really sort of tough European leagues. So there has been a feeling that Brazil is losing its edge at producing these kind of creative players. And thank God that Neymar came along. But one of the reasons why Neymar was able to come along and develop the way he has was that he stayed longer, really, than he could have gone when he was 15 or 16 to Europe, but he didn't. He wanted to stay playing for Santos, which is quite a small club in comparison to the other big clubs. So he was allowed the freedom to experiment, to play, to get creative. And then when in 2010, 2011, other big clubs came calling, because Brazil was doing so well economically, Neymar was able to stay because he was doing sponsorship deals, which actually made it just as lucrative for him to stay in Brazil as it was to go to Europe. So he was able to carry on playing in the kind of slightly carefree way that he was playing. And also what that has done, which should not be underestimated, is that in Brazil, even though the football there in the club, the domestic football is not very good, that's the football that people care about. That's the football that they watch every day, that's on the front page of the newspapers every day. So they actually call the Brazilians that play in Europe the estrangeiros, the foreigners. So they feel much, they love Neymar a lot more because they've seen a lot more of him. They've seen him grow. And I think that's also been quite crucial for this sort of feeling of kind of renewed confidence, renewed happiness, and of the national team, is that its main player really feels more Brazilian. Ronaldo never felt Brazilian. He was 16 when he went to Holland. Romario also. You have to remember that Brazil, it loves football, but it doesn't follow Europe as much as it follows its own clubs.
I think of Diego Costa when you talk about players leaving, and he's obviously a player who has chosen to represent Spain over Brazil, which I imagine is fascinating from sort of a Brazilian perspective. Right now, as we speak, Alex, they're getting ready to announce the squad. Phil Scolari is getting ready to announce a squad for Brazil. And you mentioned that you think that if they lost the final this time, it wouldn't quite be as impactful as the 1950 loss. And I understand that we're talking about different eras and different cultures and media has changed. But there is lots of talk about the pressure on them to win this World Cup. And I imagine it would be a massive disappointment if they did not. How does that manifest itself within Brazil, the pressure on the players, and especially with so many of them being out of the country and playing their club football somewhere else?
Yeah, there is going to be absolutely huge pressure. I think that all the news stories so far have just focused not on what's going on in the pitch, but focused on are they actually going to be ready in time? And I think there is this feeling of, the whole thing about the World Cup is to show the world how great we are. We've kind of already shown the world that we're not very good at organizing these things because we're delayed. So I think that is the narrative. And, I live in London, and it was actually before the London Olympics. There was a similar narrative of, it's over budget, it's a disaster. We're kind of slightly embarrassed by it. But when it happened, we loved it. It was fantastic. And it's now seen as a great success. I think the same thing will happen in Brazil. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure there will be so many protests. If they will, I'm not sure they will be reported very much. The big story will be the football. And Brazilians will get behind it and be really excited by it. And yes, there is huge pressure. But I would say the pressure is not as bad as it could be. It's not as bad as it could be. For example, Brazil doesn't have the world's best player. So in 2006, it had the world's best player, or, FIFA voted, it had, Ronaldinho. In 2002, it had, Ronaldo, maybe Rivaldo. So when you have the world's best player playing for you, you are, in a sense, the poster boy or the team for the entire tournament. Everyone is looking at you to kind of own the tournament. It may be a blessing in disguise that Neymar hasn't become the big player in Spain this season, because actually all he needs to do is just win for Brazil rather than be the best player in the world. So you have that. Also, Brazil, I think, are a bit more realistic. They realize that you can be brilliant and still lose. That's sort of what football is all about. And I also think that, they're happy that the team is playing in a better way than they were 4 years ago. And the memory of 8 years ago is also not a good one. So I think there is, Brazil, the two things people say about Brazil are it's the country of football, el país de futebol, and God is Brazilian. Deus brasileiro, God is Brazilian. And I think that there is this sort of kind of superstition. It's all about feeling, and the feeling about the team now is kind of quite good. They're worried that essentially it's all down to Neymar, because they feel that Neymar is going to make the difference. If Neymar's on an off day, Brazil aren't going to win. But if Neymar is playing well, they feel that they've got it. And so I think that there is a bit of a buzz, but there is also that realization that they've had great teams before that have lost, so you can't be too surprised. I think actually maybe Brazil losing won't be as big as if it is either Argentina or Uruguay winning.
Right.
That, in a sense,
yes,
would be a lot more painful.
Yeah, I imagine that the team that lifts the trophy, if it is one of their rivals, will make a difference. We're talking to Alex Bellos, author of Futebol, The Brazilian Way of Life. I have no Portuguese ability, so if I butcher that, I apologize. But you can find it on Amazon.com. Again, Brazil getting ready to announce their squad. Phil Scolari apparently addressing the press. We may cover that when we finish with Alex. I guess, Alex, the last thing I'll ask you is, I think it's easy, and I'm obviously speaking from an American perspective, I think it's easy for us to assume that football is everything in Brazil, and that should translate into tangible numbers, and attendance should be massive, and attention should be massive, and the clubs should be big and have lots of money to spend on lots of players. And it's obviously not the case in a lot of places. And I wonder, I've seen some discussion about the attendance in Brazil. do you address some of the issues that are sort of inherent? You talk about the organization. Obviously, corruption is rampant. Do you talk about some of the issues that are inherent in the sort of disillusion with fans going out to the stadiums and actually watching their teams play?
Yeah, I mean, the organization of football in Brazil is an absolute mess. There are lots of and I do talk about this at length in the book, as well as other things about the culture of Brazil and etc. We've got to remember, in Brazil is a massive country and it has terrible transport links. So football grew up essentially as very state-based, and you have the Sao Paulo clubs, and they're only really interested historically in playing other Sao Paulo clubs. The Rio clubs, likewise, only interested in playing the Rio clubs. And when it was only after the 1970 World Cup that there became a national league. And so this league, it doesn't people don't care so much about it, because if a Rio club is playing a Sao Paulo club, there'll be no away fans, because the transport links, no one can afford to go. It takes too long. And also, no one really cares if you beat some team from over there. You only really care if you beat the other team in the city.
Right.
So Brazilians haven't got into the idea that having a national league is interesting. Also, there is this feeling that traditionally they only like cups. So they only like knockouts, where each game has meaning. So they're not quite used to this idea that go along to see the first game of the season, because they know it's actually maybe quite irrelevant. The other reason why people don't go to the stadium so much is that there are lots of midweek games, but they're on at 9:30 in the evening.
Mm-hmm.
They're on 9:30 in the evening because the rights are with Globo, the main TV people, and Globo make their money from the soap operas. And the soap operas are every night. The telenovelas end at about 9:30. So no one's going to want to go there if you're working the following day or if you've got children. And most of these big stadiums, the Maracanã, I'm not sure now, the big stadium in Rio, it never had a car park. So it did have a car park, only terrible, one tube that goes there, one metro underground, but just doesn't take you from any way that you might actually be. So kind of everything's just kind of badly run about it. And, the way that you would change that is that you would have not a monopoly with the television, so it could all be on at good hours. You would, improve the rail infrastructure, possibly. You would, it's also that the Brazilian leagues are on at a strange time. They don't coordinate with the European league, so you have players leaving halfway through. Where do you stop? But a lot of this is just about bad organization and incompetence, and it hasn't stopped them producing great players or loving the game.
Exactly. I think that's the conclusion that I continue to come to, no matter what happens in Brazil, and no matter the intrinsic issues they may have in organizing the game, getting a World Cup together, the people being upset with the government. There is still that at the very base, this is a culture that loves the sport, perhaps unlike any other culture in the world.
Yeah, including they totally do. Because it's not the case that they love the sport; they are the sport.
Right, exactly.
It's what defines them best. It's what they think about when they think of what makes them Brazilians.
Yep, absolutely. Alex Bellos, author of Futebol, the Brazilian Way of Life, joining us. Find the book on Amazon.com. Alex, I appreciate your insight. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, and very well pronounced.
All right, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to grab John Arnold to talk CONCACAF. We'll move north, Central America, North America. Soccer Morning, North American Soccer Network, NASN.TV. Stay right there.
Welcome back to Soccer Morning on NASN with Jason Davis.
Back on Soccer Morning, joined now by John Arnold. Follow him on Twitter, Arnold, John. You told me you were going to change that. Haven't gotten around to it yet?
I was planning on it, but I'm just not sure what the better alternative is. People are welcome to tweet me. I'm sure I'll get some stupid ones, but tweet me some suggestions. I'll mix it up. I want it to be shorter so I can get more conversation.
I know you wanted it to be shorter, but CONCACAF John has a nice ring to it because you are CONCACAF John. You are that guy. You're the CONCACAF expert on world football. Phone in and you bring your knowledge to the table here at Soccer Morning, and we very much appreciate it. You can find John at Goal and MLS in 30 when it gets put out on NASN and American Soccer Now, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, anywhere that'll have me, but Goal's my main home, and then love doing everything else as well.
Okay, I just want to give people the full John Arnold experience. And speaking of that, let's talk some CONCACAF. Let's move to Central America and talk about CONCACAF qualifiers that are not the United States, and we might get to Mexico in a little bit. But the one roster we have for CONCACAF teams going to the World Cup is Honduras. And I guess the first question to ask, and this is the standard question, are there any surprises, John?
Yeah, there aren't really any huge surprises, and I think that's part of the reason that Luis Suarez, the manager, Luis Fernando Suarez, to differentiate from another Luis Suarez in football. I think that's one of the reasons that he just didn't release a provisional and kind of was the first or second, I guess, after Bosnia guy to release his roster. You know, the only spots that were really up for grabs was the third keeper, which, you know, probably not going to see too much from that, and maybe a defender spot or two. For the most part, it's about what, you know, most people paying attention, Hondurans and nerds, would have expected. You know, you've got a lot of MLS guys. Jerry Banks is on the roster, Oscar Bonilla Garcia, Marvin Chavez, who I was a little surprised made it. But he gets called in as well, and Victor Bernardes Muma rounds out the MLS crew. And then you got some familiar faces too. You know, some ex-MLS guys. Andy Najar is on the roster. Roger Espinoza is on the roster. Carla Costley's in there too. So it's a roster that, you know, Americans are probably familiar with. You know, if you watched Honduras in the Hex, this is mostly the squad that they went with when they were healthy. A couple changes up at forward. Ronnie Martinez has been in fantastic form. He led the Clausura, the Honduran League, Liga Nacional. He led them in goals, and he gets the nod. Maybe the one surprise is that he got the nod over Royer Roro Rojas. And also Jonathan Mejia, a guy who plays in Spain, who they naturalized, didn't get the call. He's on the, you know, backup 7 whatever players in case somebody gets injured.
Yeah, you look at this roster and you're sort of struck by the fact that Honduras is exporting some of their talent. I'm not sure how this is necessarily that different from previous teams, but you've obviously got Minor Figueroa. Everybody knows he's at Hull. Juan Carlos Garcia. Wilson Palacios, clearly, and then Roger Espinoza, who was in MLS, and Andy Najar at Anderlecht, and let's see, and then the MLS guys. I'm looking at this, and you said this is, you know, it's pretty much the team that we would expect or we've seen before. This is not exactly a young team. Was there any young guys that missed out here that maybe, I mean, except for maybe their goalkeeper who could have gotten a shot, had the experience and grew into a role in the Honduran national team?
They got a couple young forwards. I think that's going to be their real challenge is finding a place to score because, as you mentioned, you know, their back line is very experienced. You got Maynard Figueroa. He usually plays centrally for Honduras alongside Bernardes. You got Emilio Izaguirre, who plays for Celtic and is a really fantastic left back who I think just because he plays in Scotland and that league is so top heavy with Celtic just always winning, you don't hear too much talk about him. The right back spot is a bit of a problem, but other than that, you know, I think the forward is really the question. You know, are they going to be able to score goals? You got a couple young guys, Rojas, who I mentioned. Anthony Lozano was the top scorer for Olympia this year. He's 21. So a couple guys who maybe could have missed there, but even in the midfield, you know, there's really not that many guys who have any sort of national team experience who are really available to be called. You know, MLS fans might be familiar with Johnny Leveron from Vancouver. You know, he was kind of somebody who maybe could have made the roster, but I don't think it was too surprising not to see him make it. This is a team that really, it's definitely not a golden generation situation, but it is a team that's been together for a while, and I think they could, you know, their group is not as difficult as some of the other groups. They're playing France, which will be tough, obviously. Switzerland be tough, obviously, and even Ecuador is a difficult team. There's no easy groups of the World Cup, and this is one that I think Honduras will look at, maybe not with confidence, but definitely with the thought that they can get a couple of points off it. So I think that, yeah, it is kind of an older group. It's a group that, maybe you fall on the experience cliche,
Sure.
but I do think they've been around, and I think that'll serve them well when it comes to Brazil.
They have a player in China? Honduras has a player in China? I'm a little surprised by that.
Yeah, that's Osman Chavez. He's had a weird career path. He was last in Poland, and he was there for quite a while.
Interesting.
At least 3 or 4 years, and then he moved from Poland to China, as is tradition.
Yes, as you do, as you do. Now, my question about Honduras is, what's success? I mean, there's a couple of points and going out in the group stage. Is that success? I mean, can they be happy about that if they play France to a draw, if they play Ecuador to a draw, which, as you said, is going to be difficult. And you'd imagine that in both of those cases, and the way that this group lays out for Honduras, they're going to have to defend first, and then hope to find goals in other places. Switzerland, who has sort of done a style shift, but they still may pose a challenge that way if Honduras has to go break them down. What's success?
Well, it's funny when you read the press and read the internet comments, which is never really that good of an idea for any nation or language, but you see different people's expectation and different nations' expectations. For Mexico, it's we got to get to the 5th game. For the United States, it's we want to get out of the group and then see what can happen there. And for Honduras, it's a 4th game. They want to get out of the group and then play one more game. That's going to be tough, but I don't think that if they don't do that, it will be seen as a failure. I think that, as you mentioned, if they get a couple points, if they get a draw against one of these big clubs, or if they're able to get a win and not move out of the group, I think that that's still going to be seen as a success, just because I don't want to say that the nation is more realistic, but it does seem that expectations are certainly lower than some of their CONCACAF brothers. I'm just not sure that Mexico has the team, or even Costa Rica, the United States has a team where the fans can really be making demands. I think it's going to be tough for all the CONCACAF teams. But with that said, I think that if Honduras gets a couple points and doesn't get out of the group, I don't think it's seen as a failure, maybe not triumphed as a success, but I think it's one of those things where, there's a lot of, it's a rough situation. We saw a lot of the coverage when the United States played down in San Pedro Sula about how difficult life is there and how many murders there are and how tough things are, and that gets trumped up a bit, I feel like, but it also is part of the reality of living in Honduras. And I think some of that comes with just a joy to see the soccer team achieve any success. And so I don't think you're going to see it labeled as a failure. Now, if they don't get any points, you're probably not going to see a lot of people celebrating the team, waiting for the team at the airport when they come back or anything like that. But if they don't get out of the group, I don't think it'll be the end of the world for Honduras.
I came across this today. Our friend Eric Beard shared this on Twitter. It's the Global Sport Pronunciation Guide for the World Cup. I just want to see here. We got
Wilson Palacios.
So if you try to get your accent down, because I'm going to be working on this the entire World Cup.
Arnold Peralta.
I can't do that. I can't do Arnold. I can't.
That one comes easy to me.
Okay. Well, yeah, you're better than me, John.
My last name is Arnold. That's all I'm saying.
That's a good point. Luis Garrido. Okay. Let's move on. Let's talk about Los Ticos and Costa Rica, who does not have a firm roster yet. We wouldn't expect them to. Honduras maybe a little bit more solidified. Talk about Costa Rica. You said that, there might not be a team in CONCACAF, or a nation in CONCACAF that has a team where you can sort of have high expectations. But of the groups that these countries are in, the United States has the toughest. Honduras that's rough. Mexico, you can kind of see a possibility of them getting out. I know Costa Rica isn't going to be favored to get out of that group, but I feel like they can give some of these teams a really hard time. Italy, England, this doesn't seem beyond them to me.
I think you're being optimistic, Jason.
Okay.
I'll be honest.
Right.
They did look. I thought they were a really good team in the Hex. The United States was clearly the best team, I felt, and then I thought Costa Rica was right there as maybe 1B or just 2, if you won't allow me to have a B. The thing is that since then, and you can't look too much into these friendlies, but since then they've had some really poor games, some poor friendlies. They lost to Australia after the Hex. They were just destroyed by Chile, who of course is a very good team, but it was a side that it wasn't full sides or anything. It was a January friendly. They lost 4-0. They lost to South Korea, who, we saw U.S. and Mexico have not too many problems with. They did get a win in their March friendly. So there's inspiration to be taken there. And there's also good inspiration, I think. And if you're going to see Costa Rica make some moves and have a chance against Uruguay, Italy, England in that group, Keylor Navas, who plays goalkeeper for Levante and has just been in fantastic form, he's going to be a big part of that if they're going to get any points. He's an excellent goalkeeper. He's 27 years old. Plays for Levante. He's been linked to some of the bigger clubs. I don't think he'll go to Barcelona, which is one of the clubs that people kind of keep throwing against the wall to see if it'll stick. I don't think that's going to stick, but I do think that you might see him at a really big club soon. He was my CONCACAF player of the week this week, and it's just been incredible. His reflexes are great. His distribution is pretty good too. He's a really all-around goalkeeper and the kind of player that CONCACAF is known for producing. His defense is solid. They've been together a long time. You got Roy Miller from the Red Bulls on there, who people might laugh because he gets this weird reputation for a couple bad games that he had last year. But he's a decent player. He might not even get a start. Giancarlo Gonzalez from the Crew will start at center back, especially if they go 5 in the back, which I expect them to. So you have some reason for hope and some reasons to think you might be able to keep some teams off the board. And then when you have players like Brian Ruiz, Joel Campbell, Celso Borges, who play an attack and have been in pretty good form as well, you might be able to give some teams some trouble.
You just completely 180'd on me, John. You said I was being optimistic. I didn't say that they're going to get out of the group. I'm not sure I would expect that. I mean, again, it's Uruguay, Italy, and England. I very seriously doubt they will. I just think that they can be competitive, and maybe it's the same sort of bar for Honduras. Although I imagine that Costa Rica fans would hope for a little bit more, depending on how the group laid out. And here it is, very tough. Yeah,
you're right. What I'm trying to say is they can be competitive in some games. I don't think they're going to be able to get out of the group. I mean, I have to say you probably see a last place finish unless England really stumbles, which is possible knowing England. So no offense, English people. I think it's going to be difficult, but they do have some reason to say, this is a good team. I mean, you don't make the World Cup by accident. Everyone at the World Cup is going to be good. A good team generally. And I think that, if they can succeed in their system, I think they'll do well. If they concede early goal against Italy, early goal against Uruguay, I think it's all over because they're going to have to come out of their shell a little bit. And they can attack, but, defensively, they're solid when they can stick with it, when they can keep their line. But when they can't do that, I think it's a problem.
Okay. Vince on Twitter wants to know if Oviedo is going to be in this squad.
He said that he's going to be in a training camp, the 2-week training camp. It sounds like he might be good, but obviously you're gonna want to know that he's pretty much fully fit.
Right.
He made the point that he doesn't want to fully injure himself. This is just an interview he gave to one of the English papers yesterday. So he said if he's not fully fit, he's not going to go. He's not going to push it. That's probably true. Oviedo is a player who can be key for them. He's played left back for them. He can also play left midfield. But honestly, they have some other players who can fill that role. They've got Junior Diaz, who plays for Mainz in Germany. He started more hex matches at left back than Brian Oviedo did. So it's not necessarily that you have to have Oviedo. I get that, people want to see him there, and it is going to be a great story if he does make it back. I think he would play if he got back, but I'm not entirely sure. So he's going to test it. He's going to have a go with it, and we'll see if he's fit enough. If not, I don't think it's going to be that big of a problem for Costa Rica.
Okay, there you go.
Michael Umaña, Brian Oviedo, Joel Campbell.
Okay, there's your pronunciation guide for Costa Rican players.
He's an interesting one. Just anecdotally, Joel Campbell, because some people do the Joel Campbell.
Right. I heard you say that the first time around, and I wondered how is it in. I don't know. I think if you say Joel, you're probably okay. Let's move on briefly here while I have a couple more minutes and talk about the big dogs in CONCACAF. Mexico, not less than the United States. And by the way, Jurgen Klinsmann's 30-man roster expected to drop on Monday. That's per Stephen Goff of the Washington Post. Let's look out for that. Let's talk Mexico and Miguel Herrera's preparations for the World Cup. I am continually fascinated by his stewardship of this team and what they had to go through to get to the World Cup in the first place, and the reliance on his own club players. When you look at what Mexico is going to take to the World Cup, and nobody's quite sure yet, no official roster, are you convinced that there's going to be enough of a balance between the best players they've got and sort of what Herrera is comfortable with to run his system?
I think you're going to see European players on the roster. Chicharito is going to make it. Hector Herrera is going to make it. Hector Moreno is going to make it.
Mm-hmm.
But besides that, there are some players who are very talented in Europe who might not make it because they don't quite fit what Herrera is trying to do. Javier Aquino is not on the some of the leaked rosters, and he hasn't really been getting much traction. Gio dos Santos is a question. Andres Guardado is a question as to whether he'll make the roster or not. So you definitely have a team that it is interesting trying to find that balance, and it makes me wonder if Mexico wouldn't be better served by doing something that's not Herrera's, wingback formation. But that's not going to happen. He has to find the players who fit that, and I think you are going to see a heavy Club America influence on the World Cup roster. With that said, he's still going to take Europeans who are, probably more talented than some of their counterparts. So it's going to be strange, I think, to find that mix, to watch some of these guys who are used to playing in Europe try and tailor their game. Gio dos Santos, I think, is a great player. I think he's one of Mexico's better players, but I don't think he fits in Miguel Herrera's system, and I think Herrera probably knows that.
Mm-hmm. So
he's one of those guys who you might be expecting to see who maybe won't actually see the field as much as you'd expect in Brazil. Same with some of the guys who might get left out. And in goalkeeper, he just doesn't seem to like Guillermo Ochoa, even though he's had a really fantastic season in Ligue 1. So we'll see what he calls in. But yeah, it's going to be fascinating to watch him try and blend those players from America used to his system, and even some of the guys who play in Liga MX who have played that system in a couple more matches than some of the European guys. But, with the training camp, he does have some time to try and get those guys acclimated and figure out who's going to work and who's not.
I can imagine he can't leave Gio dos Santos off the squad, but if he goes to Brazil and doesn't use him, and then they end up crashing out of the groups, I don't know. I think there's so many storylines subtext, and Mexico's one of those teams where you can imagine them sort of falling flat, but you could also imagine them kind of wowing everybody through the group stage and making a serious run and maybe getting that fifth game, as we talked about. All right, very, very quickly, because I have less than a minute before I've got to move on. Speaking about Mexico, we have another one of these kind of weird, murky ownership situations, potential for a team to avoid relegation not because they deserve to, but because something bad is happening with the Mexican club. Querétaro, who we know had problems paying players, now the owner is being charged with corruption, and the government has taken over the club, as far as I'm aware. They need to be sold, and if they aren't sold, then potentially Atlante can stay up. Is that the situation?
Yeah, and of course, as it always seems to be, it's rumors and more rumors. But essentially, what the situation seems to be is if Querétaro doesn't get sold, owned by the Mexican government, and now if they don't get sold this week, then either both teams contesting the Ascenso playoff, Leones Negros and Estudiantes Tecos would get promoted, or maybe Atlante would stay and the promotion winner would stay as well. So who knows, Jason? It's always murky, especially after every Liga MX season. It seems like we go through this now. So this will be 2 straight years, and I don't know. You hope it's not 3, but
this is a little bit different than, hey, my team went down, I'll buy another team, move them, and keep them. That's a little bit different. It's still so fascinating.
It's less dirty. You feel not as bad about it, but it's still not exactly what you want to see.
Not good. Arnold, John on Twitter. John Arnold from Goal joining us, talking CONCACAF. Enjoyed it as always. Thanks a lot, John. Appreciate it.
A pleasure, Jason. Take care.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to grab Peter Shad, voice of the Vancouver Whitecaps, on the radio up there in British Columbia. We'll talk to him about the Canadian Championship as Vancouver takes on Toronto tonight. Soccer Morning, North American Soccer Network, NASN.TV.
Welcome to Soccer Morning on NASN. Here's your host, Jason Davis.
A little hard rock. I don't know what that is. I don't know technically what genre that is. Joining me on the phone now, Peter Shad, voice of the Vancouver Whitecaps on Team 1410 in Vancouver, covering, he's there in Toronto tonight, or today, for tonight's game in the Canadian Championship, Vancouver Whitecaps, Toronto SC. Peter, how are you, sir?
Mr. Davis, nice to chat again. Thanks for having me on, as always.
Thanks for joining me. Now, how excited, I don't even know if I can view it down here in the States, Peter. I imagine there may be some stream somewhere, possibly. I don't want to send anybody into anything illegal. But how excited should I be for Vancouver Whitecaps, Toronto FC in the Canadian Championship?
Well, I hate to tell you this, Jason, but there's a lot of Canadians and Torontonians that aren't all that excited. I think one of the things that the Canadian Soccer Association is going to do, in fact, I know they're going to do it, is they're going to move this tournament to a little bit later in the summer when there's not as much competition with hockey and all the other things, and a little closer to Canada Day like it used to be. So this is the last year that this tournament will be held at this time of year, and so it's got a dual meaning this year. The team that finishes first amongst the three Canadians in MLS will represent Canada in the CONCACAF Champions League next year, which is kind of a big deal. And then following that, so they'll have the tournament again, but in a later part of the summer. So it's got a little extra special meaning for the Whitecaps this year because they kind of have two chances to get there. They can go the tournament route to get into Champions League play this year, or they can finish first amongst the Canadian teams and represent Canada in 2015. So the problem has been over the last couple of years is that the tournament has lost some of its verve. And I think part of the reason was when there were three MLS teams, it wasn't as exciting for the teams like Montreal and Vancouver of lower divisions to play an MLS opponent. And even though the Whitecaps had great crowds at home last year, and the final at BC Place against Montreal was a tremendous occasion and a great game, the lead-up games have been poor. The gates in Edmonton were terrible. The gates in Montreal and Toronto were not very good. So they just decided that maybe it's time to rejig this a little bit, just get it away from hockey, which is, of course, so precious here north of the border.
Sure. The other, I certainly want to talk about the dynamics around this particular game, and obviously Edmonton Montreal is the other matchup. But I wonder about expanding this. That's got to be a part of it as well. I mean, right now it's just the 5 professional teams in Canada. I don't know if there are other professional teams, but certainly the NASL and MLS teams. How does Canada get to something closer to what the U.S. Open Cup is or the FA Cup is?
I think we're getting closer, Jason, because I'm hearing rumblings all the time about ownership groups that are really keen on getting into NASL. And there's also a pretty strong sense that there's going to be some USL Pro teams out west and in Canada. So starting with NASL, Winnipeg's just built a beautiful new stadium that looks to me more like a soccer stadium than what it's really been intended for, which is the CFL Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Mm-hmm. And I would think that they'd want a tenant because they had tremendous success during the Canadian Soccer League years. We've heard Hamilton, which has also redone their stadium, formerly Ivor Wynne, home of the Hamilton Tiger Cats of the CFL. And I know that CFL owners who are tenants of these buildings would love to have co-tenants, and NASL makes an awful lot of sense, especially because that league is growing, and it's just the right sized markets for what the NASL wants to do. Calgary's another name that we keep hearing associated with NASL. The Whitecaps want to have their own USL Pro team. I don't know how that works in the context of a Canadian Championship, having basically 2 clubs in the same tournament. Not sure how that would work, but I do know that Victoria would be very interested to have perhaps a higher tiered team if the Whitecaps, Portland, and Seattle were all in USL Pro close together. We've heard that Seattle would mind having a team in Tacoma. Portland was thinking perhaps Eugene or even in Portland or on the outskirts of Portland. And the Whitecaps want to have a team close to home so that they could have the exposure of the coaching staff with their young players, because that's what their young players need. They need meaningful minutes right now. And so Victoria looks at that and goes, well, we could piggyback off 4 teams basically in this sort of regional setup along with Sacramento and all the other West Coast-based teams, and it'd be a lot more viable. So we'll see about that in the future, but I definitely know that there will be more Canadian presence as the years go on. And, you know, Ottawa, I think, will be a solid franchise. Edmonton's still trying to get a foothold there at Clark Stadium. They don't get the crowds that I think that they want, and they're going to have to pretty soon. So I hope we do, because I think both Hamilton and Winnipeg would be excellent markets, and I think the tournament would be a lot better if there were, above 8 teams or so.
Yeah. Speaking of tonight's first leg with Whitecaps and Toronto FC, it's sort of two teams in different places. And what I'm hearing about the Whitecaps approach is that Carl Robinson may go young and inexperienced and get some reservists out there. I know Omar Salgado has been recalled, or at least that was the report. We can talk about whether that means anything for him in the main, in the first team, or if that's perhaps just for tonight. But Vancouver taking this, I don't want to say they're taking it less seriously than they should, because it's up to each team to navigate their schedule. But the approach of young players and inexperienced players, what do you expect tonight from Vancouver?
I just tallied up what I expect to be the starting lineup, and it's averaging 21.54 years of age.
Wow.
And features, and that includes potentially Nigel Rio-Coker, because they're having some real problems. Who's 29, so he brings the average right up. But imagine that, 21.54, and if I'm right, 6 Canadians starting in that team. When Carl Robinson was introduced in the winter, he said, I'm going to play young kids, and the model for this club going forward is we're going to have to get younger, and we're going to have to play these kids we're developing in residency. And the ownership group was asking the last 2 years, listen, why are we sinking $2 million a year plus into these programs and sending all these kids off to play in U.S. academy games around the Pacific Northwest if we're not going to play these kids eventually at senior minutes? I mean, the reason why you have the residency program is to get the odd homegrown player in there that doesn't count against the cap. And Carl's come on and said, I totally agree with you. And because he has so much confidence in these players, he's not afraid to put them out. And we saw a small example of the roster at its youngest in the Rose City Invitational Tournament in Portland in the preseason. And the Whitecaps played a very senior-looking San Jose team with Marco Bustos, who was 17, Kakuta Mane, Darren Maddox, so a young group. And they held up and they won the game. And it was absolutely brilliant watching them, because they did not look like kids. They looked like men amongst men. And so he really believes in his kids. And that's the way forward for the Whitecaps. They want to bring in, develop, and then move on players and try to keep a core of about 5 or 6, like the RSL model, for example, and keep them around, a group of half a dozen, the consistent guys, and then just have all these youngsters playing in amongst them. And if that works, it would be a tremendous model, and it could be profitable if they can be that platform club to bigger clubs overseas. And that's, one of the things that they really want to try to do. So I'm really looking forward to tonight. 6 Canadians in our city. People have been crying out, why have we not seen Canadians playing even in this tournament? And this is the best opportunity, playing away from home, giving the kids a chance. And then, if the Whitecaps are in a hole in a week, then they can put a more senior roster out there, because they don't have a game the following weekend. Toronto's in a different position, because Toronto doesn't have a game this weekend.
Right.
So they can play their guys, and some of their guys are heading off to the World Cup. So we could see a lineup that's very similar to the one that played against New England over the weekend with Bradley and Defoe. The only difference will be Julio Cesar won't be in goal. Joe Bendick will probably be in goal. And that's okay, I think. This is going to be a real great test for the kids. And I don't get a sense from any of them that they're in the least bit daunted by this challenge. In fact, it's a very mature group. You mentioned Omar Salgado. Omar Salgado's biggest issue has been maturity. And Marco Carducci, the 17-year-old goalkeeper for the Whitecaps who's going to start tonight, at 17, he's a more mature player than Omar Salgado. Now, hopefully Omar's time in Charleston has helped him. He's been getting minutes. He's been getting on the score sheet. But, I mean, his biggest problem is between the ears. And, ever since being drafted first overall, that's been a problem. And he's a player who just hasn't taken personal responsibility yet. So I was very surprised, to be honest with you, that he was recalled. And I do wonder if that's sort of a last chance situation, or if he's being put in the shop window somehow, because the sense I got a few weeks ago was that the Whitecaps were ready to move on from Omar. That's interesting in light of the news that Kenny Miller has moved on and is no longer a member of the Vancouver Whitecaps. We're talking to Peter Shad, voice of the Vancouver Whitecaps on Team 1410 in Vancouver. The departure of Kenny Miller, not completely unexpected. His contract ran out in the summer, or in about a month, I suppose was the word.
But the question now is, do the Vancouver Whitecaps attempt to fill the void left by Kenny Miller, or do they just move on with what they have and you'll start to see some other guys get more minutes in his place?
It'll be a combination of both. They're always looking. They have some targets. The one thing that Carl Robinson said that was very interesting was if we're going to bring somebody in as striker, we are going to bring in a pure goal scorer. And I asked Carl Robinson, how often do you stay in touch with Camilo? And he said, we talk all the time. And when I asked him, would you consider bringing Camilo back, he giggled, turned 3 shades of red, and didn't answer the question. I asked Bob Lenarduzzi, Whitecaps president, what he felt about the Camilo situation, because he was the most mad out of everybody when that whole thing went down last year. And he said we would never say never to a player of his ability. So despite what happened, and this is just pure speculation on my part, but Carl and Camilo were very close. Things are not going well for Querétaro, as you know, and they need to be sold here pretty quick or there's going to be a problem. Camilo's not getting paid by the club, by the way. He's getting paid either by the government or by the league. I'm not 100% sure. So things are dire there. So really what would have to happen in that case is that Camilo would have to fire all his agents and he would have to join, he'd have to join the base group that Carl's a member of and that's doing a lot of work with the Whitecaps and who they trust. And I would not be surprised if it happens. That's one thing percolating off in the distance in the ether there. But as far as who they have, Darren Maddox's injury isn't as bad as everybody thought, so he'll be back sooner than later. Kukutumani can play straight up front. Eric Hurtado can play straight up front. And I'm not too worried about the in-term, to be honest with you. In fact, I think the interesting thing is over the last 2 games, the most exciting and really encouraging hour of the Whitecaps that I've seen in the 4 years of MLS were the last 30 minutes at Real Salt Lake and the first 30 minutes against San Jose, and Kenny Miller wasn't a part of any of that. He had to play any part. And that's why I think Kenny Miller's presence on the team was actually holding things back. And just to finish up on the Camilo point, it was Kenny Miller's salary and the fact that he scored 1/3 fewer goals than Camilo and played 1/3 fewer games might have been the biggest reason why Camilo said, listen, guys, if you're not going to pay me, I'm bolting. And so that's going to be really interesting to watch down the road here.
That would be fascinating. I would be more interested in how Camilo comports himself on a return than maybe even his play on the field, because we know he's a talented player. Last thing I'll ask you about here, Peter, taking a little in a little bit of a lighter direction. I saw that Jay DeMeritt got written up in the province for being a loud neighbor. What's that all about?
Well, it's not the first time, apparently, but as my colleague at the Vancouver Province, Mark Weaver, who's the beat writer for the Whitecaps, put it, he said, this particular note got handed to the wrong person on the wrong day, and it became a front-page story. And, you know, one of the sort of percolating understories, undercurrents, I guess, in the Whitecaps is the fact that Jay's not had a very good season. He was probably responsible for both goals allowed against San Jose. He's been left out of the squad on 2 trips. He's definitely not back next year, but he's the captain right now, and he's on a pretty good ticket. And Johnny Leverone did not make the Honduras squad, partially because he wasn't playing. And Johnny Leverone is Carl Robinson's guy. So it's interesting that Leverone was left off the Honduras roster the very next day. Jay DeMeritt's on the front page of the paper for partying. It's one of those kind of odd coincidences that made me wonder if we've seen Jay DeMeritt play for the last time as a Whitecap. I could legitimately make that argument, and it'll be interesting to see, you know, how much time Johnny does get now, because, like I said, Jay's not had the best year, and I don't think he's Carl's guy. But it's a delicate situation because he's also the first ever signing. He's the club captain, and he's kind of been the face of the franchise. But there is an element of the fans and the supporters population in Vancouver that just doesn't appreciate Jay, and so that's another story going down the road, along with, you know, whether or not Nigel Rio-Coker's playing his last minutes with the Whitecaps, because, you know, he has also not come in. And one thing that Carl said is you got to earn your money. And if you're sitting on the bench, I can't have $460,000 players sitting on the bench. And I know that there are some teams in MLS, talking to some of my MLS colleagues around the league, there's some teams that are interested in Nigel. And I know from overseas, there's actually, there's some people that are interested in Nigel. So over the next few weeks, we could really see a reshaped Whitecap squad that is very light on veterans, but also a little lighter in the pocketbook as well.
Interesting. Kenny Miller, obviously, if Rio Corcoran leaves, and with a demerit situation, I mean, is that something where they would ship him out? Would he sort of hang on and play mentor to Leverone and other guys? How would that work?
Jay himself has said, and I have to say, Jay was excellent prior to the San Jose game because we wondered if he would start in that game, and he did. And, you know, it's just one of those things, you know, they're up 3-0, and in the last minute of the first half, he goes after a ball he probably didn't need to, goes through Alan Gordon, gives away a penalty, and now they got a chance. And then late in that game in stoppage time again, Chris Wondolowski, unmarked, probably his guy, gets the shot, not a good one. He sticks his leg out and deflects it past his goalkeeper. And Jay himself has said, I'm happy to play that role as mentor, if that's what it means. Mm-hmm. But I do wonder if push came to shove and he was not in the 18 week after week and he was still on that salary, whether he would decide to retire. And he wants to be in Vancouver. He's married a local girl who's also a high-profile athlete, in Ashley McIver. And so he wants to remain in Vancouver. But the biggest clue to me is what Carl's already said. I cannot have 200,000 plus players sitting on the bench in Major League Soccer. That's not going to work. It's not how it ever works in the league. He needs 60 to 70,000 players sitting on that bench, and he needs his $200,000 players playing.
Yeah, it's dead money otherwise. Peter Shad, voice of the Vancouver Whitecaps on 1410, the team 1410 in Vancouver, joining us to talk about the Canadian Championship and some potential movement around the Vancouver Whitecaps. Thanks for your time, Peter. Enjoy the game tonight. Best of luck in the future.
Anytime, Jason. Thanks for having me on, as always.
Talk to you soon. There goes Peter Shad. Very, very good stuff. I love having Peter on. He's got one of those radio voices. I don't know how mine measures up. I've never done play-by-play. This came up on Twitter, actually. Somebody suggested, because I mentioned how difficult it was, right? Somebody said, why don't you do play-by-play? Because I was talking about British announcers and American announcers. Why don't you try it? I'd suck. I know. I've talked about this before. I already mentioned it. All right, let's take a look. We've got a lot of games tonight around the world. Premier League, City Villa, Sunderland, West Brom. Obviously, massive game for Sunderland. If they can get a point off of one of their last two games, they secure safety. They cannot be caught by Norwich. MLS tonight, Houston, Columbus, Seattle, FC Dallas, and San Jose, Colorado. Clearly, the marquee game is Seattle, FC Dallas, although Mora Diaz is out. Changes a lot for FC Dallas. Houston, Columbus there at BBVA Compass Stadium. It's already getting hot in Houston. It's already hot where I am. What's going on? Canadian Championship, obviously, Toronto, Vancouver, Edmonton, Montreal. We just had the Brazilian roster announced by Luis Felipe Scolari, Julio Cesar, Jefferson, Victor, Dani Alves, Maicon, Marcelo, Maxwell, David Luiz, Thiago Silva, Dante, Enrique, Luis Gustavo, Paulinho, Ramirez, Fernandinho for Manchester City, Oscar Willian Hernandez, Bernard from Shakhtar Donetsk, Fred, Neymar, and Hulk, and Joe. Joe's the name that stands out there. Joe, who's back in Brazil, who was formerly of Manchester City, and I think he was in Russia briefly, right? Was he at where was he? Somebody tell me where he was in Brazil. I should pull up Joe's background. All right. Last couple of minutes of the show. Phone lines are open. 347-756-6276. If you have any comments on anything that's happening, the Brazil squad, the Honduras squad, your potential USA squad, again, coming out Monday. We have to wait. It's Wednesday. We have to wait until Monday to know who Jurgen Klinsmann is going to call up. That 30-man squad, not even the 23, just that 30-man squad to take to the World Cup. CSKA Moscow. There he was. That's what it was for Joe. Thanks again to Peter Shad, Alex Bellos, and John Arnold today. I like the CONCACAF insight. I think it's easy to get into your bubble. Oh, Honduras is a team we play. Oh, I know a couple of those guys. They used to play in MLS. But it's good to get some fuller insight into what Honduras is going to take to the World Cup. And now that we know what their roster will be. A couple of news and notes from a couple of things from the news and notes file. Number one, Mohamed Al-Fayed, former owner of Fulham, has said, and installer of the Michael Jackson statue that previously graced the area around Craven Cottage, has blamed Fulham's relegation on the removal of the Michael Jackson statue from Craven Cottage. Because it was a lucky statue, because without it, Fulham can't play to their full abilities. It's Michael Jackson. Of course, Michael Jackson is lucky. It's insane. Insane. Al-Fayed deserves all respect for what he turned Fulham into. Again, sort of in the context and taking this and looking at what Fulham managed to achieve by just staying up for as long as they did. I still find that a fascinating story. And now they're going out on the championship. And Mohammed Al-Fayed is saying it's because they removed the statue. The statue was a charm, and we removed the luck from the club, and now we have to pay the price. When Shad Khan asked me to move it, I said, "You must be crazy. This is such a fantastic statue which the fans are crying out for. But now he has paid the price because the club is being relegated. He called me because he told me he wanted Michael to return. I told him no way." What the heck is going on? What is this? I don't understand what's happening. Oh, Fulham fans. I bet you just get red in the face when you think about these things. It's all because of the Michael Jackson statue. David Beckham and his Miami football club team, soccer club team, has been told by the mayor of Miami-Dade County to look at a different site. I don't know the geography. I always say this. I don't know the geography of Miami, but apparently the site is adjacent to American Airlines Arena, which is where the Miami Heat play. Something about a boat slip. I imagine there's going to have to be some reclamation there, some land reclamation, in order to make this work. And I saw a tweet this morning said David Beckham is in the Miami-Dade County offices, being that guy, shaking hands, trying to get people on his side. David Beckham walked into Miami-Dade County Hall this morning to meet with commissioners over Major League Soccer team and stadium plans. That's from Patricia Mazzi on Twitter. David's going to be doing yeoman's work to make this happen. He's gotten serious opposition to the idea of Dodge Island and that Port Miami site. Now, the Miami-Dade County mayor has said, go look at this other site. Now, I don't know that means that the mayor is saying, I think his name is Jimenez. I don't know that he's saying you can't build at Port Miami. I think what he's doing is acknowledging that there is some significant opposition from some big money. Royal Caribbean has some cash. That Port Miami group, which has 13 local mayors on it, has some heft. They have some pull. They have a voice. And at some point for Beckham and his team, it becomes, is it even worth the effort anymore? How much effort are we going to put into Port Miami versus what we're going to get out of it and when it eventually might come to pass? And how long can they wait? Because again, MLS has not yet bestowed a franchise on Miami. They are waiting on the stadium deal and Beckham to get all of his ducks in a row. I know that's not fair, but that's what they're doing. 956, you're on the air.
Yo, this is Johnny Bravo. How you doing, man?
Johnny Bravo, what's up, man? Got a couple minutes. Hurry up.
All right, man. I just want to know what's your take on, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Gideon Zelalem.
Gideon Zelalem. Does he switch or does he? I have no idea because I'm not Gideon Zelalem or Gideon Zelalem's father or Arsene Wenger.
So what's your gut feeling, man? I want to know what your gut feeling is.
My gut has said Germany all along, and I don't know that him getting his citizenship changes that necessarily. I still think it's going to end up being Germany. I also think that, well, okay, clearly Jurgen Klinsmann has other things on his plate right now, and I'm sure he's out there recruiting Gideon Zelalem, maybe texting him, "Hey, Gideon, how are you? What's going on, man?" Yeah, I'm sure he's doing it. But I mean, let's not get ahead of ourselves. I mean, it's a little bit like Julian Green, who, while I'll admit is talented, and I know Gideon Zelalem is talented too, neither one of them have proven anything at the senior level in any significant way. One has an FA Cup appearance against Coventry, and the other one has a Champions League appearance for a couple of minutes. I don't. And
a goal.
Who has a goal?
Julian Green has a Champions League goal.
Okay. Well, I maybe I blanked on that. But either way, neither one of them have been consistent enough for us to say they can make a difference right now. Now, in the future, maybe they could. And clearly, U.S. Soccer and Klinsmann should be trying to get every talented player that they can to declare for the United States. So I'm hopeful there's an effort. I'm just not going to worry myself with it right now because for me, he is a player for 2018 and beyond. He's 17 years old. It's a little early.
That is true.
Yeah, I appreciate the phone call.
I don't want to get the hype up, but if U.S. lands this player, it would be massive.
Okay, appreciate the phone call, Johnny. All
Federation.
right, man. I'm excited by Gideon Zalalem's talent. I just don't want to hold him up as some kind of savior, just like Julian Green. And I don't know. I've seen some of the passes he made. He's excellent. Maybe he'll be something one day. I'd like to see him play a little bit more before I go, yeah, let's just get really, really excited about that guy. All right, we're out of time. We didn't get to talk about Tim Howard's PETA ad, which was absolutely insane. We didn't get to talk about Sasha Kleshin potentially leaving Anderlecht and going to LA Galaxy, is the rumor out there right now. I didn't get a chance to talk about Helena Costa, a woman being named manager of a Ligue 2 club in France, former Iranian women's coach. This is, as far as I know, the second woman to take charge of a men's team. The first was a woman in Peru last year, 2 years ago. I want to look into this because I've talked on this show before, and I'm going over here, but bear with me. Talked on this show before about the odd double standard because, as pointed out by people who are constantly watching women's soccer in the United States, there is one woman head coach in the NWSL. So the men's second division in France has the same number of women head coaches as the women's league in the United States. That's strange. It doesn't seem right. All right, we got to go. Thanks a lot again to Alex Bellos, John Arnold, Peter Shad. We'll talk to you guys tomorrow. Soccermorning.com, iTunes, ratings and review. Soccer Morning on Twitter. Davis JSN. What else? If you want me to ever call a game, let us know. Soccermorning.com, soccermorning.com, soccermorning.com. Thanks to Auntie for the music. Bye.
There is no question here. I try to remember.